Chapter 24, Success. The school committee meeting lasted another 15 minutes. When it was over, the Kentons and the Shaws and Mr. Z walked out into the parking lot together, and Mrs. Shaw said, "How about we all go over to the Route 25 diner and celebrate with some ice cream? Our treat." Mr. Z stopped beside his car and took out his keys. "Thanks, but I have to get home." "But the rest of us can still go, right?" said Greg. His dad said, "Well, if Mr. Xenotopoulos can't come, then I think we'd better not." He reached out to shake Mr. Z's hand. "You did a great job in there." Mr. Z smiled and shook his head, pushing the praise aside. Nodding at Greg and Mara, he said, "The congratulations belong to these two. And I really like what Greg said about the school store idea. I think the committee did too, but there's still Mrs. Davenport." Mara said, "But you heard her. She likes comics now." Pointing at the box in Greg's hands, she said, "And taking those to her house? That was genius." Greg smiled and said, "Yeah, but..." Mara cut him off. "No, really, that was a great idea, because if she hadn't read them, and if she just stood up and screamed and shouted about how awful comic books are..." Greg shook his head and said, "Sure, but..." "I'm serious," Mara said. "That was the best idea, except for when you said you'd give half our profits to the school. So I say we should still go and get ice cream, and Greg gets to pick anything he wants, even a double banana split." Because he... Almost shouting, Greg said, "Would you be quiet a second?" Mr. Z popped open the back of his car. "Greg's trying to tell you that those comics aren't his." He took the box from Greg and put it in his trunk. "I drove over to my mom's home after school yesterday, and I hunted around up in the attic until I found my old comics. 2 big boxes. Then on my way home, I decided to make a special delivery. And I was pretty sure Mrs. Davenport would like my taste in comic books, because there's no BLOOD. He slammed the trunk lid and then smiled at the group. "But no telling, okay? Mrs. Davenport thinks I'm crazy enough already." 3 days later, when the school committee vote was announced, no one was surprised that permission had been granted to Greg Kenton and Mara Shaw to begin selling chunky comics at a newly reorganized Ashworth school store, provided that Mrs. Davenport agreed to all the details. And after some spirited negotiations in the principal's office, no one was surprised that a workable business plan for the store was developed, and a trial period of 2 months was agreed to. Mrs. Davenport even agreed to be a member of the product approval committee. Mr. Z helped set up an accounting system for the school store, and Greg and Mara opened a joint savings account at the bank under the name Chunky Comics Group. Greg and Mara made good on their promise to hold after-school workshops about how to make mini comics and mini picture books. And soon they had to take on the additional challenge of being editors, choosing which stories and art to accept and which to reject. Plus, they spent time after school helping to get the new school store set up in a semi-permanent location in one corner of the cafeteria. It wasn't always fun, but there was a lot of hard work. But soon the milestones began to drop into place. By mid-October, the restructured school store had a grand opening. To start, there was a literature section, an arts and crafts section, a used CD section, a collectibles section, plus the regular school supplies. Chunky comics were sold from a rack built by Greg and painted by Mara. 12 new product ideas for the school store were presented to the product approval committee during the first month of operation. 5 were accepted. By mid-November, the 3 elementary schools in town, the junior high, and the high school had all restructured their school stores or started new ones based on the business model pioneered at Ashworth Intermediate School. The Chunky Comics rack was a popular feature at each of the new locations. The November sales of Chunky Comics were huge. 436 copies of Return of the Hunter, and 424 copies of The Lost Unicorn. The production crew had to work afternoons, nights, and one full weekend to keep up with the demand. Near the end of November, the Chunky Comics Group used some of its early profits to purchase an electric stapler and a good paper cutter to improve the speed and quality of their binding and trimming operations. In December, the Chunky Comics Rack offered 3 new mini-comics, plus the original 2. 2 of the new titles were by Greg and Mara: Creon, The Strong Survived, and The Princess's Nightmare. The third was a science fiction comic written by Ted Kendall, drawn by Mara, and inked by Greg. It was called The Trumpets of Mars. In December, Mara began working on a new volume of mini-comics about a girl detective computer genius named Haxie Spectrum. The first 2 issues were a huge hit, and those led to 4 more Haxie titles throughout the school year. Over the Christmas holidays, Greg and Mara got some help from another 6th grade friend and launched a simple website, chunkycomics.com, to tell the story of the business and also to collect email addresses for an internet version of the Chunky Comics Club. In January, Chunky Comics also issued a non-fiction mini-comic called Pythagoras and the Golden Section, written by Anthony Xenotopoulos, drawn by Mara Shaw, and inked by Greg Kenton. It was not one of the big sellers. By February, ChunkyComics.com was attracting more than 1,100 visitors each week. By April, the Chunky Comics Club monthly email newsletter was going out to more than 2,300 subscribers, and the first internet orders were shipped. Sales of Chunky Comics at the school stores in town remained strong. By May, comic book collectors on eBay were offering $5 to $7 for a copy of Chunky Comics Volume 1, Number 1 in fine condition. In June, Mr. Z received approval to teach during the summer at the local community college. He had developed a course called Turning Business Ideas into Realities. Through all the ups and downs of an incredibly busy school year, Mara and Greg both finished with grade averages between B+ and A-, a tie, or almost a tie. Greg and Mara's partnership survived 5 major artistic disagreements, 4 heated arguments about money, 2 binding arbitration sessions with Mr. Z, and 1 awkward attempt at holding hands. In late June, Greg and his dad got a call from a woman who worked at one of the big book clubs. She wanted to know if Greg was interested in exploring the possibilities of a national distribution deal for Chunky Comics. After consulting with the other key members of the group, Greg decided he was. Up on the stage during the awards assembly on the last day of school, Greg, Mara, and Mr. Z handed Mrs. Davenport a check for $1,421, a donation to the Ashworth Intermediate School Library on behalf of all the vendors who had sold their products through the school store. $923.38 of that total donation came directly from the Chunky Comics Group, and Greg Kenton could not believe how good it made him feel to give that money away. The end.